Welcome. So, you've given us quite the collection of materials about this Bob Camblin. He's got this, mystique about him, right?
Yeah.
Even with all the praise from other artists and collectors buzzing around, there's still something kind of hidden about the guy. And look, we've got these quotes, some of them pretty mind-boggling, to be honest, glimpses into a life that's, well, it seems he moved around a lot, but was also very grounded in his work, a whole timeline of exhibitions, and people really trying to figure out his art, which, let's face it, can be pretty puzzling.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. And that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating, don't you think? It's not just like flipping through a book of his paintings, neatly labeled and explained. We're trying to get to the core of how he thought about art, those moments that really shaped him, and the ideas that keep popping up in his work, even though it varies so much. And honestly, the sources you've given us are the perfect threads to start untangling this whole thing.
Absolutely. We're not aiming for some definitive Camblin explained guide here. I get the feeling that's kind of impossible anyway. But we're going to pull out those key insights, see where they connect, and hopefully you'll walk away with a richer, more complete sense of who this artist was without feeling like you're back in Art History 101. All right, so why don't we start where it all began? Ponca City, Oklahoma. Not exactly the place you'd picture as a breeding ground for a groundbreaking artist, is it? But clearly, it was hugely influential for Camblin.
It's really interesting to see how those early years in Ponca City shaped him visually, especially with the landmarks you highlighted. Think about the Marland Estate, this over-the-top symbol of oil money, and then there's that huge pioneer woman statue. These were powerful images surrounding him as a young man. I mean, just imagine that contrast, the sheer size of the Marland Estate against the wide-open Oklahoma landscape. It might have sparked that interest in the tension between individual ambition and this bigger, uncaring world, something that shows up later in his more solitary figures, right? And then the pioneer woman, she represents this stoic, unyielding spirit. Maybe that laid the groundwork for how he explored resilience and the human spirit in his art.
That's a great point. And it's not just those big public monuments, right? There's that fascinating detail about his mother, Viva Camblin, who was described as his personal pioneer woman. He kind of snuck her into his work with those intertwined VV initials. So even early on, he's layering personal meaning into this broader visual language.
Yeah.
Oh, and don't forget, he was the art director for his high school yearbook. I mean, think about that. Even then, he's showing an understanding of how images tell a story and have power.
That's really perceptive. Being a yearbook art director might seem like a small gig, but it shows he was already thinking about visual storytelling, shaping a narrative. And when we connect that to his later work, it's like seeing the early seeds of those hidden meanings and the puzzles he'd build into his art. It's like he wanted to guide the viewer's eye, maybe even challenge how they saw things from the get-go.
So then comes the Kansas City Art Institute. And this feels like a turning point. He becomes lifelong friends with Forrest Harrisberger, a friendship that lasted, over 60 years. But it's also when he really dives into all sorts of ideas. Emerson, the I Ching, haiku. This isn't just about technique anymore. It's about engaging with different ways of seeing the world.
Exactly. Those literary and philosophical interests are crucial for understanding Camblin. Take Emerson's idea of self-reliance, for example. Could that be why Camblin embraced anonymity later on? Like, he wanted the focus to be on the work itself, not on who made it. And the I Ching, with its focus on change and how everything's connected, probably influenced those recurring themes in his work. Metamorphosis and the cycles of life. And let's not forget haiku and haiga, capturing a whole feeling in just a few words or brushstrokes. That's like Camblin's art too, where a simple image can hold so much meaning.
And even though they weren't deployed in active combat, their time in the Air Force Reserve during the Korean War seems to have strengthened their bond. Sketching together on the California coast, imagine the conversations they must have had against that backdrop. This wasn't just theoretical. Their intellectual curiosity was playing out in the real world.
It adds another layer, doesn't it? Shared experiences, even outside of a classroom, can really shape an artist's view of things. Those sketching sessions by the coast were probably crucial for them, honing their skills, developing their individual ways of capturing what they saw and putting it on paper.
All right, now we come to a big one. Italy. He wins a Fulbright scholarship, right? First, he's surrounded by all these Renaissance masterpieces at the Uffizi Gallery, and then, boom, he's in the Capuchin Catacombs in Palermo. Talk about a contrast. That must have been intense, both visually and emotionally.
The interesting thing is how those experiences stuck with him. He talked about the mummy imagery from the catacombs, and that clearly seeped into his later work, especially those abstract figures. It's like he was fascinated by form, by what remains, maybe even by the idea of death itself.
Yeah.
And then being immersed in the Renaissance at the Uffizi, he absorbed it, but also pushed back against it in his own way.
We see that so clearly in his Birth of Venus. It's a nod to Botticelli, of course, but it's got this very modern energy, a tribute to KPFT radio. He's taking those iconic images and bringing them into his own time and place. And his flora, his take on the Primavera figure, that sounds even more layered with hidden meanings.
Absolutely. He's having a conversation with art history, but he's also making it something completely new. That flora piece with the mask and all those hidden images, hearts, electrons, Haiga. It's a perfect example of his art as a puzzle. He wants you to really look, to think, to engage with it.
Then he comes back to the States and gets into teaching. He bounces around a few different institutions before landing at Rice University in Houston. When he arrived in Houston, it sounds like there was a lot of excitement about his work, a ton of exhibitions.
Yeah, it makes sense. Houston's art scene was really taking off, and Camblin's unique style would have been a great fit. What's interesting is how his relationship with that scene changed over time, how he eventually left teaching and embraced a more nomadic life.
But before that, there's this really cool collaborative period, right? B&E Productions with Earl Staley and Joe Tate. The tattoo show, way before tattoos were everywhere, those collaborative drawing and painting lessons. It sounds like an incredibly creative and experimental time.
Yeah.
And then the holding firm, renovating that house without permits, it really shows their rebellious experimental spirit, doesn't it?
That collaborative energy is so important for understanding Camblin. He wasn't just off in his own world. These collaborations, those B&E events, were all about pushing boundaries, questioning what art could be and where it could happen. And the holding firm, that's like taking that creative spirit and applying it to their own living space. They're shaping their reality, both artistically and literally.
And his style was always evolving. From abstract impressionism to Mouche Volantes with Nancy Giordano, those optical illusions with dots and dashes. It's like those floaters you see in your vision sometimes, creating these shimmering, almost otherworldly effects. And then there's the Big Al series. Talk about a restless creative spirit.
He was never content to stay in one lane, that's for sure.
Yeah.
The Mouche Volantes work, with its focus on how we see things and those illusions, it shows his continued fascination with engaging the viewer's mind, making them really see. And the fact that he explored so many different approaches throughout his career, it just highlights that constant process of questioning and experimentation.
Which brings us to his artistic philosophy. It sounds like it wasn't always easy to fit into neat categories. It wasn't about following rules, but about connecting with the viewer on a deeper level, almost like a soul connection. And this whole idea of his work as puzzles that want to be solved, sometimes even with actual codes and traps for the viewer to figure out, that's incredibly interesting.
That puzzle idea is central to Camblin. He's not just presenting a pretty picture, he's inviting you in, demanding that you interpret it. Those traps he throws in, it's playful, but it's also serious. He's playing with our expectations, our assumptions. And when he said that words often fail to capture the real experience of art, he was emphasizing the importance of that direct, visceral connection.
And there are these recurring themes that run through his work. Metamorphosis, the cycles of life, the push and pull between what we see and what's hidden. He often used specific imagery to express these themes, like scarecrows inspired by Gunter Grass, puppets, skulls, water jars, as symbols of turning obstacles into opportunities. It's like he created his own visual language and kept revisiting and reworking it.
Those themes and images are key to understanding what he was really grappling with. Metamorphosis speaks to that constant change and transformation in life, the life cycle to the fact that everything begins and ends, and the tension between the seen and unseen to all those mysteries just beyond our grasp. And the imagery he used, drawn from literature and his own personal symbolism, adds another layer of depth.
And then there's the fact that he would sign his work as anonymous or anonymous artists. It's like he wanted to move beyond the ego, maybe emphasize the universal nature of art or how the artwork itself is what matters most.
Choosing anonymity like that makes a big statement. He challenges that whole idea of the artist as the lone genius and suggests that the work can speak for itself, regardless of who made it. It reminds me of some Eastern philosophies that talk about transcending the ego to achieve a greater understanding.
And then, in 1976, he decides to leave teaching and basically becomes a nomad for a while, traveling all over the place for inspiration. Italy, France, Ireland, Mexico, the South Pacific. You can just imagine how all those different landscapes and cultures fed into his artistic vision.
That nomadic period was a huge shift. He's breaking away from structures, really committing to a life focused on art and experience. All those encounters would have given him so much new visual input, new perspectives, constantly expanding his artistic vocabulary.
Later on, he settles down a bit, first in Oregon and then Louisiana with his wife Nancy. And we know that he passed away. There are efforts underway to organize a retrospective exhibition of his work in Houston, so it seems like there's a real desire to bring his legacy back into the spotlight.
Yeah, that push for a retrospective shows how influential he was, both in Houston and beyond. He might have stepped away from the mainstream art world for a time, but his vision, his impact on other artists, it's still very much appreciated and remembered.
And we have these great insights from other artists and historians. Earl Staley, Penny Serling, Pete Gershon, George R. Jackson Jr., Carolyn Farb. They paint a picture of this really intriguing and influential figure. He's been called a mystical trickster, a distillation of art, someone who always questioned assumptions and had a profound impact on those around him.
Those personal reflections really bring him to life. They show his complexity, how deeply he affected his peers, and the staying power of his artistic approach. The common thread is this sense of mystery, this feeling that there's always more to discover in his work and in the man himself.
Okay, let's talk about the interpretation of his painting, Anonymous Coastline, especially how it's discussed in Zen and the Art of Enlightenment in that YouTube video. They describe it as this cascading fog bank, this play of light and shadow, and it evokes these themes of impermanence, adaptability, and letting go, which are core to Zen philosophy.
What's fascinating is how this one painting becomes a way to understand his whole approach to art and life. The fog, it's this powerful symbol of impermanence, and the way it adapts to the unseen coastline ties into those Eastern philosophical ideas he was so drawn to. It's about accepting constant change, just like the fog conforms to the hidden contours of the land.
And there's the connection to the I Ching hexagram Huan, which represents dispersion or dissolution, this idea of clearing out obstacles and allowing energy to flow freely. The image of the fog breaking through barriers, that hint of firelight suggesting a kind of illumination, it all comes together beautifully.
That link to Juan really reinforces the themes of release and renewal. The painting isn't just a landscape, it's a metaphor for inner transformation, letting go of fixed ideas to achieve clarity. And that fiery glow, maybe it represents that moment of insight, that enlightenment when we finally let go.
And then thinking about it in the context of the Romantic period, that fascination with the power of nature and the use of light and shadow to create emotional and spiritual depth. It shows how Camblin was drawing on art history, but filtering it through his own very personal lens. Even the suggestion of turbulent water, like you see in Turner's paintings, adds to this overwhelming sense of emotional and spiritual resonance.
He's weaving together Eastern philosophy and Western art history, bringing these seemingly different ideas together in a way that's totally unique. Anonymous Coastline is a powerful visual representation of his ideas about change, acceptance, and the search for meaning in a world that's always in flux.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, a few key things really stand out. Bob Camblin was a complex and deeply thoughtful artist whose work challenges us to look closer, to think deeper, to reconsider how we see the world. His journey from those early years in Ponca City to his travels around the globe and all those different influences he absorbed, they all come together in his art, which is layered with meaning and mystery.
He didn't give easy answers or simple narratives. He gave us puzzles, paradoxes, invitations to explore both the world around us and our own inner worlds. His willingness to step outside the spotlight and challenge conventions shows a real dedication to the creative process and the power of art to transcend individual identity.
And now we turn to you, our listener. Thinking about Camblin's emphasis on personal interpretation and the puzzle-like nature of his work, what image or idea from our conversation really resonated with you? What personal meaning did you find in it? We encourage you to seek out more of his art and maybe revisit some of the ideas we talked about today.
It's about engaging with the work, letting your own experiences and perspectives guide your understanding. There's no single right way to interpret Camblin's art, and that's what makes it so powerful and relevant.
Thank you so much for sharing these incredible sources and joining us on this journey into the world of Bob Camblin. Until next time.